I'm Carson Bird, Faculty Director of Research Initiatives at the National Center for Institutional Diversity here at the University of Michigan. I'm excited to be serving as the moderator of today's seminar, using multiple forms of data to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in liberal arts education. We have a fantastic panel assembled to consider ways that data has been used and can be used to address issues of access to and diversity, equity, and inclusion within liberal arts education. And we plan to discuss the benefits and challenges of analyzing these issues in relation to both student experiences and outcomes. What work remains to be done and what work is most urgently needed. I'd like to welcome both our speakers and our audience to this discussion, and I'll say a bit more about our speakers in just a moment. This event is the fourth of 5 seminars dedicated to measuring the liberal arts in the year-long College and Beyond to Liberal Arts and Life Public Colloquium series. In our 5th seminar on March 19th, researchers from the University of Michigan's own study, Measuring the Liberal Arts Education, College and Beyond 2, will take the stage to share information about this ongoing project. The series will conclude in April with a plenary session on Making the Case for Liberal Education, featuring another fantastic panel and moderated by Ann Curzon, Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and Arts at the University of Michigan. We hope to see you back for those events. I'll take this opportunity to tell you briefly about the College and Beyond 2 study and the driving questions behind both the project and this Colloquium series that shares its name. The benefits of a college education are numerous and well documented. College is associated with a wide range of economic, social, personal growth, health, and well-being outcomes. But exactly how college transforms students' lives and which aspects of the experience are critical to this transformation is less well understood. Many people believe that a liberal education, a broad grounding in the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences is key to developing the foundational knowledge and set of general skills, attitudes, and perspectives that facilitate this transformation. Others believe that college is most valuable when it is oriented towards providing specific vocational skills. Either way, surprisingly little is known about how particular undergraduate experiences, academic and otherwise, lead to long-term effects. Champions of the liberal arts point to the ability to think critically, to see questions from more than one perspective, to analyze precisely diverse forms of evidence, and to communicate effectively in many modes. They claim that a liberal education will prepare students for citizenship, a lifelong aptitude for living well and effectively in a diverse and global society, as well as economic opportunity and the ability to confront global and local challenges. With the support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the College and Beyond 2 project is developing quantitative metrics and collecting rich administrative and survey data to shed light on these propositions and on the broader question of how undergraduate education can be improved to best serve students and society. I hope you'll join us for the College and Beyond 2 seminar 3 weeks from today on March 19th to learn more about the project. This project and this Colloquium series are generously funded by the Mellon Foundation, and I'd like to gratefully acknowledge their support. Also, I'd like to thank our series co-sponsors at the University of Michigan, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, the Inter-University Consortium of Political and Social Research, the College of Education, the Education Policy Initiative at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the School of Education, and the National Center for Institutional Diversity. Before I turn to introducing our speakers, I want to give just a few details about how today's event will proceed. Our panelists will each make brief remarks to begin, and then we will have time for discussion among the panelists as well as questions from you. Please feel free to submit your questions as they occur to you via the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. A live transcript is being generated through Zoom, and you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to view subtitles. The event is being recorded and will be posted on the series website in the near future, and videos of past events are also available on the website. If you're tweeting about today's event, use our hashtag #CollegeandBeyond2, all lowercase letters. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Longer biographies of our speakers listing their many accomplishments, and there are many, are linked on the Colloquium series website. First is Silvia Hurtado, Professor of Education at the School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she was Director of Higher Education Research of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA for over a decade. She previously served as Director and Department Chair of the University of Michigan's own Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. She has written extensively on student college experiences, campus racial climates, STEM education, and equity and diversity in higher education. Next is Nicholas Bowman, the Mary Louise Peterson Chair in Higher Education, a professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership Studies, and the Director of the Center for Research on Undergraduate Education at the University of Iowa. His scholarship uses a social psychological lens to explore key topics in higher education, including student success, diversity, rankings, admissions, and quantitative methodology. And I'll add that Nick completed his graduate studies here at the University of Michigan. Anthony Jack is Assistant Professor of Education at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. His research documents the overlooked diversity among lower income undergraduates, those who enter college from local, typically distressed public high schools, or the doubly disadvantaged, those who do so from boarding and day school and preparatory high schools as well, known as the privileged poor. He published his first book titled The Privileged Poor, How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students in 2019, and his current project focuses on the world of work among undergraduates. He's also a member of our Diversity Scholars Network at the National Center for Institutional Diversity. Welcome to our presenters. And before we get started, I have one last piece of information to acknowledge. And that's this past year has brought many challenges to our work and lives. Unfortunately, we have witnessed losses among family, friends, colleagues, and many others as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to exacerbate existing health disparities. As we prepared in early fall to assemble our panel for today's conversation, we originally reached out to Dr. Andrew Nichols of the Education Trust to be one of our panelists. Sadly, he was not able to join us and succumbed to brain cancer at the end of January. Dr. Nichols was a fierce advocate for racial equity in higher education, and as he wrote in a 2020 report on access to top public universities, quote, "These last few months have shown to anybody paying attention that racism is alive and well in this country. Racism permeates higher education too. It is time for public college presidents to take substantive anti-racist action that matches their soaring anti-racist rhetoric," quote. Taking inspiration from Dr. Nichols' work and life, and in light of the January 6th Capitol insurrection, it is apparent that diversity, equity, and inclusion remain a vital, yet underdeveloped and underutilized aspect of liberal arts education that can promote the ideals of not only our universities, but our society as well. So with this in mind, let's get started. Silvia Hurtado will begin, and I'll turn it over now to you.
Thank you, Carson. This is great to be talking with folks at the University of Michigan. As you know, I was there for 12 years, so started my career, and it was an extremely important time. And we were working at the time on the affirmative action case, so a lot of research was dedicated to that. So today I want to start a little bit, maybe step back a bit. Before using data, I think we need to really think about what are some of the guiding frameworks that we are using to frame liberal arts education, or the college experience in general, and how is DEI connected? How is diversity connected to all those elements? So I want to take one of the frameworks and just work through it a bit with some of the theories and make that connection, because it's not always explicit in a lot of the frameworks we're using how diversity is a component of that. So let me take The American Association of College Universities, Essential Learning Outcomes. They put a lot of work into that over the years. They have value rubrics that are used in teaching, and to really basically say how some of them are applicable to addressing diversity. Knowledge of human cultures and the physical and natural world really connects to Davidio's notion of enlightenment. In other words, understanding content, but also this learning comes from contact, from actual contact from people who are different from each other, but also contact with various communities. The intellectual and practical skills, which they have many, and our theory of diversity in learning that we posited as part of the court case that came out in the Harvard Education Review, we posited that diversity is central to providing the kinds of experiences that advance critical thought, promote cognitive disequilibrium, that is, removing people from their embedded worldviews to consider that of another, move them from their habits and routines in terms of who they typically interact with and what they learn. And that essentially is the objective of a liberal education. So the link with diversity in these is very clear. The notion of personal and social responsibility, that usually taps into civic learning. And I'll have a reference in the chat, or it'll be provided later. There's an issue of Daedalus focused on improving teaching and strengthening the college learning experience, where I have a piece called Now is the Time, strengthening our democracy with civic learning. And so really thinking that through. And so there is a framework within that called the civic learning spiral, where notions of self, helping students develop their voice and identity, communities and cultures, understanding those, knowledge, skills, values, and also public action, how to act. And that's part of the civic learning model. Then there's the notion of integrative and applied learning. And experiential learning is really key, associated with reflection. And it's essential for, in Frere's terms, critical development of critical consciousness and commitment. And in Kolb's term, really understanding abstract conceptualization in developing new knowledge. For many, race and racism could be an abstract concept until they actually are confronted with these issues, race and racism, and understanding at the individual level and systemic. So we really need to find better ways to help students understand at the systemic level. So I want to use a different framework. We are engaged in a STEM initiative with the National Institutes of Health, and there's a very specific framework they've developed called Hallmarks of Success. These hallmarks then have been developed, believe it or not, with the group, with NIH, with all the interventions that are being funded by NIH to increase, certainly to increase the representation and diversification in science and training. And it has elements at the student level, the faculty level, and institutional level. And so measures are then developed and aligned with the hallmarks. So everything we do and write actually aligns with a hallmark, so we understand what progress we're making at the institutional level or the faculty level. In that case, it's faculty development for diverse faculty, and also faculty development in terms of mentor, for example, culturally aware mentor training, which is going on. I want to say that campuses collect a lot of data, and give one final example before I turn it over to my colleagues here. And that's, we're in the middle of developing, believe it or not, UCLA is becoming a Hispanic serving institution. And so we have launched that initiative. Our chancellor said we're going to achieve it in 5 years. And I want to use some aspect as we're gathering data across campus to understand access, completion, and also student experiences regarding this. I'll take one example, and that's one of my favorite outcomes that I study, and that sense of belonging on campus, how different groups experience it. Because it affects completion, it affects college experiences, it affects their level of engagement. So we have survey data on campus, we collect annually, We've done campus focus groups, or what we call platicas. We have conversations about sense of belonging. We also have a phone app called the Bruin Experience, where students can really just automatically say, they can tap and say how they're, in terms of how they belong, how central they feel to the institution. These different offices don't talk to each other. But on report, we're going to bring together that data. So there's really rich data and various elements of the institution that can be brought together and used. In this case, it's to lay out a set of concrete steps that will increase diversity, address not just Latinx, but first generation and low income student experiences on campus to get them to completion. And so I'll leave it at that, because I think that that ties into some of the work that some of my colleagues are doing here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Silvia. Nick, it's up to you to carry on the conversation here, and looking forward to some of the many points that you have to bring to this dialogue on what diversity, equity, inclusion, and the liberal arts education, what does that mean if we want to figure out what that looks like on our campuses, as Silvia was pointing out? What are the components?
Well, thanks so much for having us here today and for organizing this talk. I'm gonna hopefully succeed in sharing my screen. Can you all see that? Great.
Looks good here.
So I want to talk a lot about specific forms of different ways that we can get data. Perhaps the most common way of capturing data around diversity, equity, and inclusion pertains to surveys. And there's a lot of good reason why. You can administer a survey to an entire population of students, potentially all undergraduates in an institution. Depending on how long you're willing to have that survey go, you can ask about a variety of different aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. I also want to note one of the best surveys I've seen around this is the Diverse Learning Environment Survey out of UCLA that Silvia helped head up in its creation. Although a lot of times when we think about surveys, we think about closed-ended questions. We could also do a lot with open-ended questions to provide some additional insights that we might not be able to get from asking the extent to which students strongly agree or disagree with a variety of different attributes. But there are certainly limitations. One of those is, so you might find, for example, that, hey, the campus climate is not great for racially minoritized students, which is a very common finding. But then what exactly do you do with that with survey data? Because you really need to know a lot about what that looks like, how that happens, what groups is this most prevalent for. And so it's kind of difficult. And part of the reason is, you could do some follow-up surveys, questions, hey, if you clicked yes on this, then, and you're doing an online survey, then you could get a follow-up question. But you really can't get those additional insights in quite the same way in surveys as with other formats. So in some ways, this can serve as a first step. And actually, I was very interested to hear a couple of the things that Silvia was talking about in terms of whether focus groups or other ways of collecting data, perhaps other, more informal conversations and so on to get some qualitative insights. I actually want to spend the rest of my time just talking about 3 forms of data collection that I haven't seen used very often in higher education research and assessment, whether pertaining to the liberal arts education, DEI, or other aspects that could be very useful here. So one of these pertains to campus mapping, which literally means you show a student a map, a physical map of that campus, whether you do this paper and pencil or online, and you have them provide, like what are a handful of places where you feel particularly supported or welcome or a sense of belonging, at the institution. And also you then ask, where are the places where you don't feel that same sort of support or belonging? And the nice thing is once students identify these particular locations, then you can ask them, well, why is it, that that's the case? What is it about these places, that's desirable or undesirable here? The nice thing is you can get a broad overview across, you can get a whole bunch of students to do this. You can also explore group disparities because, of course, the place that some groups of students might feel very welcome does not imply that other groups of students will feel welcome there. To give you just a little bit of an idea of what this might look like, this is a map of supportive environments at Michigan State University. So I'm not very familiar with Michigan State, but I would really want to know what's going on at those red dots there. And we would actually, in some ways, this provides interesting new data, which then we want to get some additional data to shed some more insight. Another approach for getting a greater understanding is doing a walking interview, which is actually just as it sounds. Instead of doing a one-on-one interview that happens over Zoom or inside some office building, you're literally walking around with a student to get an idea, because you can really get a lot out of the environmental cues, whether you're walking around with someone as they're sort of doing what they would normally do in that day, or if you ask that student to, hey, actually guide me around the places that you tend to go on campus, and maybe a couple of places that you intentionally don't go on campus and why you might not go there. And one of the really nice things about this is the specificity that you can get out of this. You can ask really meaningful and direct follow-up questions about this in a way that you're just not able to do, in a lot of these survey-based format, including the campus mapping format, even though that campus mapping could then lead to conversations about this. The final type of approach is a sort of event contingent sampling. So this is taken from some of the broader literature around experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment. So this is a study that actually occurs over a week or multiple weeks. And basically you ask students, whenever the event of interest occurs, that's their cue to respond to a survey. And so they would go in, it might be something on their smartphone, that they say, okay, this is what happened, this is where it happened, this is with whom it happened, and providing these additional insights. Of course, one of the really important aspects of this is really carefully describing what's that event to which they respond, because you might want to know, for example, about microaggressions that students experience in campus. But if you define that very open-endedly to include anything that might constitute a microaggression, there's going to be some students who will be responding this or thinking they should respond to it very frequently. So how can you determine what this looks like? And one of the potential benefits of this is also, I think often in higher education, we study the things that are within our particular institution, but particularly as we think about this past year and all of the events and issues related to DEI that have influenced students' lives, a lot of those did not actually start, at least, on campuses. And this can actually get to some of those, when students are the ones who are driving these events that are meaningful to them, you can get some insights there. That's what I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. That's some fascinating new techniques beyond our surveys. I love my surveys, I love my regressions, but sometimes, you just need to talk to people, right? And so it's a nice little segue over to Dr. Tony Jack. Please help us try to figure out what else are we missing here about how diversity, equity, and inclusion in the liberal arts education, the liberal arts experience kind of manifests on our campuses.
So I want to join Silvia and Nick and say thank you all for hosting this conversation and allowing us to be able to converse about, well, as someone who went to a liberal arts college and kind of tries to create that environment, even here at Harvard, we need to be able to ask ourselves these kind of questions. And so I appreciate be able to give the space to this. And so I'm going to follow up kind of like where Nicholas just ended, right? And say, let's move beyond the survey. We need to make sure that we understand what questions we want to ask, right? And so that's what we need to fundamentally start. It's what questions we want to ask, and then what do we want to get from the kind of research project that we are creating. And I want more, especially when it comes to informing policy at schools, informing the agenda for national associations. I think we need to return to and invest in qualitative research in a new way. Interviews and ethnography are two central pieces of, two central techniques that we need to really, really invest in and allow our students the space, the time, and especially, again, the resources to be able to develop. I will also include historical and archival research because a lot of the things that we are happening, when you think about the campus color line, by Eddie Cole, right, taking a historical perspective, a lot of the major decisions that we are having right now are not necessarily, are not new, not necessarily, are not new, right? When he talks about presidential decisions to open up for NCAA sports, versus when they were actually more into politics in the 1950s and 60s, right? So we have to be able to contextualize, but I want to focus on two methods that I use in particular with interview and ethnography, because when you think about the liberal arts education, liberal arts experience and liberal arts education, and understanding how students are experiencing them, interviews allow you to tap into to culture in a very important way, right? Culture, if you think about culture as meaning making, I want us to run and not walk to examining how students and also staff and faculty, which oftentimes are left out of the research practice and people who are contributing to the data, not just who receives data, but who actually get to participate in the data collection, how they attribute meaning to their experiences, and then how that meaning then shapes their behaviors, their actions, and their outlooks. If we really want to understand how students are making sense not only of this moment, but in relation to what they are experiencing back home, we have to actually talk to them, right? Because there's a limit to an open-ended question, because how much is the student actually going to write? But as someone who is doing interviews currently right now, and also before, it both it surprises me, and then it doesn't surprise me how much students just need a space to just be heard, right? And that's one of the beauties of being an interviewer. It does border on therapy for students, and many scholars have written about the therapeutic interview, and also the consequences of that is like the burdens that we bear because we absorb these stories. But but you get a very rich sense of students' lives, right? And that's incredibly important, because even if you are just taking a snapshot, you can cover so much information. But if you do repeated interviews, again, over time, and not just around events, we can also be able to have a very rich set of experiences, like so what happened between the beginning and end of freshman year. And so many events will happen, but there are also sometimes events that we don't know happen, right? Because as Nicholas said, like, if it's microaggressions, or if it's something that is not a flashpoint event like January 6th, or the death of George Floyd, or a riot that was close to campus, or a protest that was close to campus, we don't know about it, right? And so how do we begin to tap that? And here is where I want to also highlight ethnography as a tool, right? Because you can take the pulse of a community in more ways than just developing a survey, as we were discussing. Like, it's multiple ways of understanding. And what the ethnography could do is it not only gives you live updates, but it helps you be more nimble in addressing disruptions, right? Especially if it is an institutionally funded, but not necessarily institutionally bound ethnographic project, right? And that's incredibly important for be able to say, like, this is picking up, right? You can test it later and see how many people have experienced it by connecting the ethnographic observations and letting that fuel and inform the questions that you put in your surveys. But it's also incredibly important just to have the ethnography in the field. And here I would actually want to invite more anthropologists back into this conversation, especially anthropologists of education, because as far as being a part of policy debates, those who use ethnography as their main focus have not been informed, not been at the table as much in policy, in conversations that inform policies and practice at universities. And so with both of these, the last thing I want to say before handing it back over is to adopt these type of methodologies requires an investment of resources. Surveys are incredibly expensive in and of themselves. Qualitative research can also be, and sometimes is more expensive, depending on the type of interviews you do, how long they are, how many sessions with people. And by the time you include transcription, which is oftentimes the biggest budget item, you can have a pretty hefty price tag. So for universities who want to talk about DEI, I would ask them to put their money where they want their research to be, and invest in opportunities for graduate students and for professors to be able to apply for funding at the school, as well as external entities to support this research.
Thank you, Tony. Definitely a lot to kind of weigh in on here, and definitely build on each other. I think before we start kind of diving into some questions, a couple of themes really came up across all three of your conversations. And that's communication is key, and we're still kind of lacking in having all the units, all the research really speak to each other and with each other on our campuses and across, right? There's been a lot of engagement, but there's still a lot of room for growth. And I think part of this, going back to the components that Silvia mentioned, all the way through to what Nick was pointing out with different methods, and Tony was bringing out the voices, right? When you put those all together, context is key. And sometimes we miss why context is so important and how it's important in our students' lives, for example, not just in our classrooms, but across campus and where that happens, right? And this kind of brings up this idea of a microclimate that we kind of talked about sometimes in our classes, we might have come across in journal articles, but that we think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the campus climate, as this kind of amorphous concept, this amorphous aspect of our campuses, but not every department is the same, right? We'll even say like STEM departments and non-STEM departments, but there's a lot of variation there, right? But that also goes to the students, right? Like we have this very homogenizing language of like the Black student experience as if there's only one version, right? And we know that not to be true, but there's a lot of communication and changing how we communicate these different aspects about what we're finding in our research, right? And so with that, I just wanted to kind of turn back to something that Silvia mentioned, which is sense of belonging, right? The affective parts of the everyday experience. And that's something that both Nick and Tony brought in as well. And so what are some of the important findings in relation to how students experience the classrooms, whether it's liberal arts or otherwise, and the campus that can really change their sense of belonging on campuses, not to just see that it's a static thing, right? That sense of belonging is what we found on a survey, but like inequality is a lived experience, right? That it's not just this one thing we get from surveys. So what are some of the aspects of kind of measuring these things on our campuses and our classrooms would be helpful for people to think about when they're trying to redesign the liberal arts education curriculum to be more engaging around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, to kind of center that a little bit more around the student and not just some kind of checklist of components about what the liberal arts education should be, but what about the lived experience can be embedded a little bit further into these courses. And I'll open that up to whoever would like to take the bait first.
I think there's a couple of aspects to sense of belonging. All my work has really looked at experience of overt versus what we call subtle discrimination. And the subtle discrimination is what we found had persistent effects on group sense of belonging. And so we continue to see differences among groups. But now that we're breaking down by first gen, low income, and looking within groups, we're seeing a lot more variation. But I want to point out one thing is that a lot of sense of belonging has to do with underrepresentation, being the one and only. And not only that, I think it's as at least I'm teaching dialogue training facilitators, and there's still this notion, for example, both in California and Michigan, they are race neutral states, right? So affirmative action is not used, but they're still being told by others that they are given preference when they feel, in other words, that you didn't get here on your own. And it's like, and I had to the other day basically tell students, no, you got here because you were frank, not because of any other thing, because it's not, we train our readers not to look at race or gender. And so, but the fact that they still hold that belief means that it doesn't matter whether we had affirmative action or not, that discrimination is still there. And so I think that even all these years that we've been race neutral, I always do that because we know race neutral maintains inequality, doesn't change inequality, that we still have students coming in and saying the same thing. So.
Thank you. Nick, Tony, any additions you'd like to add to that?
I'll jump in. I think one thing that's important as we talk about belonging is I feel sometimes like there's an assumption that belonging is like an inherently social thing, which also sort of I would, I guess, also challenge the idea that there's academic and there's social, and those are two mutually exclusive areas. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, this is a social thing. But it's really important that belonging is something that takes a lot of components and happens in a lot of different places. And this is actually, I think, when we talk about, as Tony was, about, the need to really sit down and engage with students meaningfully, to understand, to like, does what's going on in classroom, in coursework, but not necessarily in a physical classroom, in co-curriculars, in informal conversations with peers, in the way that the campus is organized, and, what offices are where and how easy they are to access, and the extent to which they're highlighted or not. I mean, there's so many different aspects of it that can weigh into belonging, that, we can get a really good idea of what that belonging might look like, but the sources of the belonging and ways that institutions can go out improving it. I mean, I think that's where we really start needing, these other forms of data that aren't just, surveys, et cetera. There's a great, unfortunately, I got it a little bit into the Q&A already, and was actually trying to look up on one of the questions about, is there a sort of qualitative institutional research entity, which I don't know that I can, I think there are institutions that might do a little more of that, but one that's like, really heavy on that, I'm personally not aware of any that's moved in that direction. But I mean, I think is critical as we start thinking about understanding the campus that, we've got to use all of the tools that we can bring to bear in these understandings.
I mean, yeah, that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought up that question as into this dialogue right here, because one, it does bring up the quantitative bias that sometimes lead to the type of, not only the type of questions that we ask, but our responses, and so sometimes, just taking, a Likert scale to only tell you so much. And so sometimes we actually, when we do need to go into the field and actually talk to people, we see that there is greater diversity. We actually are capturing sometimes the average experience, but really it's a bimodal distribution or a trimodal, it's like three humps. And we're always missing some people because we don't know what variables to lump people in. So I was glad that you brought that. And so hopefully, as we think about the future of a liberal arts education, the future of undergrad education as a whole, we center it. But one thing I want to say in response to some of the points you made is, there's a social side to academic life, right? There is that connection to where what's happening in the classroom is intimately connected to the dorm. So we can't, I think sometimes we can look at it as social integration and academic integration, but there is that piece that connects the two, right? Because getting an A on the class and saying that you are comfortable with your major is different than saying, I feel comfortable going to office hours, right? And so even if we begin to use a qualitative understanding of what students are experiencing and say, well, how is it related to your connections to other people, we can get a slightly better understanding. But what I really hope that we do as we think about sense of belonging is a greater interrogation of the rituals and customs of campus life and how those things shape. Because as Silvia mentioned, right, it's sometimes the little small things that get you the microaggressions that you can't get away from, but sometimes it's in the air, right? It's that something that you just could, it's something that is so ever present that you just like feel you can't be here. And so for some people, it's the primacy of sports. For other people, it's Greek life, right? So we've seen the work of many scholars, even people at Michigan, right? When you think about Paying for the Party, when you think about others who study the centrality of sports teams on campus, or when I think about even the campuses that I do, the secret societies and the secret societies, the final clubs, and those which may be a minority position, but they have an outsized effect on campus life. And so when we think about the rituals and customs and actually understand what are the ones that the college thinks are part of theirs, like homecoming and family weekend and blah, 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 but then what are actually students experiencing, and showing how those are so unevenly participated in by students, but then also who's uneven, who feels completely not just not just like that's not for me, but they feel actually pushed out of it. And so we can begin to understand how what connects that to, right? The social side of academic life, we can really dig deep and understand what universities can do to better support students.
Completely agree. And I think, Nick, thank you for jumping in on the Q&A. That was actually going to be one of the first questions that comes up. Speaking to Tony's notation about the quantitative bias, right? There's this assumption that numbers are objective and their uses have only limited meaning, but we also know that most of our higher education policy is based off of numbers that are very decontextualized from the experiences that all three of you are mentioning are very important, right? And it's kind of funny, we can pick up our higher ed policy volumes that we teach in our classes or that we use in our own research, and you flip to the back and the references, and there's very little qualitative or mixed methods going into what they say an effective policy is, right? So if we think about, just funding, for example, and we say the cost of attendance is X, Y, and Z, that's great, but that's not the full cost of attendance and not how we kind of estimate that, and what students might have to be comfortable to participate in some of these kind of rituals that universities hold dear, no matter how inequitable they are, right? So I think that raises a lot of challenges for institutions to figure out, where do we put this in to our universities, right? I mean, one way could be, we can knock on people's door and say, hey, you're a qualitative researcher, I would love to have you come and do this study, right? But faculty come and go. So I guess the question would be, where do you see the most effective areas within universities to embed more qualitative research, more mixed methods research, so it's not just kind of going with the wind with whoever happens to be on campus, but becomes an integral part of how we look at equity and inclusion on campus? So
yeah. I did a study at Cornell, and it was it was qualitative, basically, and I do mixed method, basically. I started with quant, and now everything is mixed method and case study. So I started with a transformative paradigm model where I basically said priority would be given to various communities that feel marginalized in this environment in all that we do, and this was going to be put into action. The information was going to be put into action in terms of real changes can happen at the institution. And I want to just tell a little bit of an interesting story. Is not only was our approach different, because I think, and Tony knows this really well, is that the issue was we had to go in with the fact that there were going to be multiple realities coexisting, not one single climate, right? Not one single climate, but multiple realities coexist. And so our main focus was making sure we were true to those multiple realities. And I remember having an IR person say, well, what if we're not portrayed correctly? And I said, that's if you have one reality that you think exists. I cannot not represent the multiple realities that exist on campus. That's where I am true to that. And a good example with the quant and qual, because they had done a quant and the qual was to mesh with that, was, and this is very disappointing, but it happens very often to American Indian students, Native Americans, is that because their numbers are so small, their numbers are hidden in the survey. No, they're not just, they are left out. In other words, they ask their students to complete these surveys and then never report anything on those groups. So my goal was to do those interviews and focus groups really focused on that one community, because obviously their voice was going to be entirely missing from the survey part. And here was their opportunity. And do you know what they said? We're invisible here. And the very fact, the way those quantitative data was used, reinforced that invisibility. And they didn't know all the policies behind that, but it had just been released at the same time. Transparent, open campus, they're showing everything. Everything's online, by the way. All their quant data, all our qual report is online. And it was very instructive because we felt an obligation. And so having an external person come and do those interviews, I think, was useful. But really working with a campus task force committee that was going to roll everything into campus practice was absolutely essential. So I always think when I'm working with institutions, I say you need to have the campus research team who's going to work with us and the campus practice team that's going to be the implementer. So thinking about that, but we've got to do something about that because we are silencing voices when we think that we're actually providing more insight.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's really instructive. And also, I think your point about how the categories are used and misused are really key. We had a question in the queue about that, about our data being limited and really insidious in how we assume who's there or who's not, and how we use that data for reporting, as you instructively guided us through there. And so I want to open that back up to both Nick and Tony. What are some other ways that we can kind of use quantitative and qualitative better to kind of tap into maybe the voices that Sylvia is pointing out are completely erased or at least hidden as other, and not really used to kind of pinpoint where we can do better to support students and really create a more equitable learning environment?
I wanted to add, you asked like where can this stuff be housed and how can it not be necessarily attached to one people? But we set not necessarily stipulations, but we set guiding practices for postdocs all the time, right? If a university is serious about understanding its climate and seeing how it is progressing over time, you can actually set up a system, whether you use your postdocs and how do you encourage people to come who are outside people, and you give them a different kind of access. But we've seen how this can work. My own work was as an insider outsider. When I think about Seamus Khan's Sexual Citizens, when I think about when universities are not as worried about what they're going to look like. The thing is, I'll tell you about. I wish universities cared more about what they're going to look like when something bad happens, as compared to when they find out something that's not as good that they can actually begin to fix. Right? Everyone is afraid of being called out in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they say, okay, no, we don't want that. And that's the fear. But I'm like, but yet when you have protests on campus because of racist faculty or staff, when you have incidents where students are putting themselves in harm's way for basic needs, when you have all of these kind of moments pop up, and then you want to do damage control because of a newspaper, when you could have actually had the research and say, this % of your students are experiencing this. But even more, this is what being a housing secure student feels like, eats like, sounds like. This is who they are, as in a collection of experiences, and all of a sudden you can begin to change these policies long before you are seen as a negative person. All of a sudden you may be called out for doing something right while your peers are doing something wrong. So there are different ways in which you can incentivize this kind of work. And I hope people don't go to McKinsey, Bain, and whatever else, the consulting firms like some universities have done, to reconstruct this and interview for this. And all of a sudden you're paying a whole bunch of money to people who don't know what the hell they're doing when it comes to actually understanding institutional culture of a university and those kind of practices. And so I just hope that not saying that you want to create a clearinghouse or some kind of just a center for just qualitative research, even though I wouldn't be mad at that. But there are ways in which you can bring people in, and also people have anthropology departments, sociology departments, history departments to bring new teaching and new lifeblood, and say that we're going to have sociology of ed, anthro of ed, history of ed, and be able to have those kind of conversations through postdocs, bring in new people so students can get exposed to different things and have a project that is publishable, not saying it's just report, to be able to come here for 2 years and be able to do that kind of research. That could be another pipeline for your university system to hire people as well.
Nick, do you have any insights you'd like to add?
Well, Tony just stole the main thing that I was actually sort of contemplating, is the because when you first asked the question, I was thinking like, so are these people who are like in some sort of institutional research or like studying student success office, or are these people who are whether postdocs, faculty, student, et cetera, who would be doing this work? And I think it could be either, or perhaps ideally both. I was just thinking, at my own institution, there are a number of us who are interested in these sorts of issues, and most of those people who would come to mind aren't necessarily limited, to the higher education and student affairs program that I happen to be a part of. I mean, we have some people, in physics, in chemistry, in computer science, in engineering, in sociology, psychology, I mean, all over campus, who are interested in looking at some of these issues. And we're actually just now, I was talking with some people who I know who work in the Academic Support and Retention Office about, studying some of the policies and practices here, and reaching out to, some of these different people on campus, some of whom now hold leadership roles, in undergraduate education for their college or their department, to be able to explore some of these issues, because it's really helpful. I mean, I think the more that we can get people, that it's not just like this one office, that you can, or these two people that you can, or one person who you could listen to or not listen to, but, if it's really something that's valued and incorporated across the institution, then I think the potential for change, and, really people valuing those sorts of insights and not just saying, oh, all those words, like, where are the numbers, from my 1 to 7 scale.
Thank you. And Tony, thank you for bringing us back to that point, because people are asking a lot more about how do we have qualitative and mixed methods research become the norm and not the abnormality to how we do this work. Again, it's not like this is new, but it needs to be incorporated a little bit further. And I think that everybody's recognizing that need. And, this gets to who we're talking, not just about, but with, right? It has to be a community endeavor, right? It has to be a certain level of engagement instead of just looking at a student as a subject, as a collaborator, and figuring out what is going on their campuses and why, right? And so this also leads us to not all of our students are undergraduate students. We have a lot of graduate students that are on our campuses that have really a pretty interesting, let's say, trajectory going through academia, not necessarily student, but not yet professional. And there's a lot of dynamics that go on around their educations and how they're contributing not only to the liberal arts education that we're talking about, mostly in this series, but also to the campus itself, right? They're an integral part of this. So what are some of the areas you see related to graduate education, maybe talking with staff members, the people who literally make sure the lights are on and everything is functioning on our campuses, that are important for kind of cultivating a more equitable campus that we haven't really done a good job talking with and really shedding light on their experiences and needs to create a better campus?
I think staff are probably, they're probably the most likely to respond to any of our climate surveys because they're almost rarely asked these questions, and they play an incredibly important role for our students to help them navigate the institution in a lot of ways. And so we don't recognize how they're an important part of the learning process, and recognize and empower staff to do more. So, we have been doing climate studies with staff, and the response rates are usually higher. I know for a while, Arizona was doing talking circles with staff and doing some of the dialogue and the identity issues, the bullying, all of that comes up. I think Adriana Kizar's work is very useful also in understanding how people are engaged in change initiatives on campus, and they get threats of firing or they're bullied on. And so these issues happen, and it's unfortunate because they're very important with our students, undergraduate and graduate students, in terms of helping them through, giving them direction, bringing their name forward when others do not, if their contacts with faculty are not useful. For graduate education, the largest issues have been lack of transparency or inequity in funding and how they're funded to pursue. Some are struggling, others are well-funded, and it has to do with who they're connected with. So we're studying now culturally aware mentoring, and we have about 30 campuses we're engaging. I hope to get Michigan involved. And this is at the graduate level. So we are training, and then we're studying what kinds of changes happen as a result, because there are more initiatives. Some of them are externally funded. This is an NIH funded project. But there's certainly a huge area when you look in the literature to find out more, particularly departmental climates. How are those being eased? How are those changing? There's very few studies when that's essentially where graduate students live. They do experience the rest of the institution, but not so much as they do their department or graduate program.
I would just want to add that when we do staff, I hope it's staff like with a big S, because when I think about some of the interviews that I've done and am currently doing, the janitors, the dining hall workers, the security guards are oftentimes some of the only people that lower income and first generation, especially students of color, are comfortable speaking with about different things. They are oftentimes some people who only people who speak their language, only people who understand their experience, who bring them home cooked food. Like, if you who will bring you some pompanos, who will bring you some Jamaican patties. And I've heard the story like that was sustained students during when they were away from home for the first times. And so I just hope that when we think about it, because to understand the undergraduate experience, we need to really rethink who are all the people they have contact with. And so, when I read a lot of qualitative research, like deans and directors are mentioned, but different kind of coordinators are less so. But when it comes to security guards and the janitors and people like that, I think that needs to be included in that included in those kind of the settings for what the research is being done. With respect to graduate education, I fundamentally think we need to apply the same tools, questions, and concepts that we have for undergraduate and apply it to graduate students and begin to understand. Whereas, we're talking about an entire freshman class, really like thinking about the differences across departments, right? So that would be like the dummy variable type thing or whatever. It's like the way in which we think about the difference between how students are being supported in econ and history and Hist and Lit and all these different programs. I think that would be something that we're understanding, because if we then see across all departments, women or queer scholars or students of color are still experiencing the same thing, that is something like more in the air for underrepresented groups, we can actually begin to address it in a different sort of way. So it's not just about STEM persistence at the undergraduate level, it's about the way in which mentors get the mentoring gap gets amplified at the graduate school level, and then you don't have the funding, you don't have the same research productivity, you don't have the same conference presentations, right? We can begin to actually understand the why beyond those statistics that we haven't really been probing as much for graduate students as we have for undergraduates.
Thanks for that addition, Tony. And Nick, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot a little bit. You have some really great research that you did some meta-analyses of several years ago that really kind of untangle all this different kind of conversation about where does your assessment of education, education proper, right, in the classroom end, and where does the social experience begin. And as Tony and Silvia have eloquently described, it doesn't work like that, right? And we have to figure out, how do these things kind of engage with each other, and how does that play into some of our assessments, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. A lot of your research is kind of pinpointed, there are certain kinds of conversations around different marginalization of communities in the curriculum that can have an impact on students' learning, right, and critical thinking. But that can also have an impact on how they understand their campus itself, right? So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what are some of the ways that we can start to, embrace this complexity about how all this is coming together and influencing what we think a liberal arts education can be, but also what we need to do to figure out what is actually going on for different students in the same classrooms and with different types of material around different forms of marginalization, vulnerability, and et cetera, right? So how can we start untangling this a little bit with all of our data that we have access to? Or maybe what data do we need access to be able to help untangle this a little bit more?
That was a lot of stuff, so I don't know how much of it I'm gonna get to. But I think one of, to continue a theme, actually, I think from both Silvia and Tony, is sort of this tension between like understanding, here's some commonality across students' experience and students from particular identities, but also like how this works at sort of a micro level, which when I think about grad school, like that comes more quickly because the sorts of different types of experiences, that someone in neuropsychology might experience versus someone, in, English literature program or whatever the case may be, because understanding some of those local things can be really important. I'm also somewhat informed by the fact that I'm married to an academic advisor, and she can say, like this faculty member, like if we're identifying like where, like things could be improved, like there are people, who are often, staff, who could say like it's actually like point to things in a way, and by talking to students, in a more in a way that you probably can't get on a survey, you also can get some of these same sorts of insights, because I feel like there's sort of the broader issue. I mean, a lot of what, like higher ed scholars do, which is understanding these issues kind of writ large, but then there's like the, okay, at this institution, we would like things to be better. How do we go about that? And I think you actually start getting into the nitty gritty once you do that, but then that creates these really difficult, situations. You're like, okay, here's this faculty member. They're teaching this course. It's not going well. And particularly not going well for students who have been marginalized and continue to be marginalized by this instructor. What do you do? You have this policy, that has, these pretty clear adverse effects, which you have to know that they have adverse effects in the first place, which I think often we don't. But then if you do know, but then there's some person who's the associate dean for something, and they're not interested in changing it. I mean, and this is where, you get into these tricky things. There's both the, sort of diagnosing what goes on, but then there's also having the will to be able to say like, and I wish, this is beyond my expertise and, willing to say, but like, how do we do things when there are like specific, things you can point to that are problematic, standing in the way of change, and make those happen? Because unfortunately, there's only so much you can do if you're saying, oh, well, so-and-so thinks this, and therefore the end.
For accountability, we developed a dashboard on the kinds of classrooms that were flunking a great deal of underrepresented low-income students, and also were, let's say, the grade distribution was not equal for women as it was for men, even though they are more likely to complete. And we created a dashboard, and we do have it. It was one of our recommendations from this study of what was happening in classrooms. And we realized the lack of accountability, it falls on department chairs and deans to reinforce it. So now they have a dashboard at their disposal. How it's being implemented, I'm not, that's a different office from where I'm engaged. I did the research, but not. But we tried to create more accountability mechanisms, and that's the problem. And particularly graduate education, mentoring, that accountability, not high. So.
Thanks. That's I think that's a really important note about accountability, and also understanding that what happens in the classroom, as Nick was pointing out, can be very individual, but it can also be community-wide, because we can have a really key, a cornerstone, gatekeeping course, if you will, in many ways, right? taught by somebody that might not necessarily be as open to understanding who all their students actually are versus who they presume they are, right? In terms of, stereotyping, for example. And that can go a long way of shifting different kinds of students out of the major, where they're like, this is not hospitable at all. Like, this person also teaches the senior capstone course, right? Like, I have to go through them again. And there's a lot of things about how diversity, equity, inclusion within the curriculum may look like it's open and welcoming in terms of maybe course content, right? But how that's enacted through the teaching, the pedagogy is really key. And how, then do we start changing what that looks like, right? We can have some really great courses, but if we don't have great engagement, that's really going to kind of undercut a lot of what benefits these kinds of conversations and activities can be, right? And so I guess this gets to a little bit more about the content matter. When you say we fix everything, say everybody's great pedagogically, we got lots of issues with pedagogy, right, and engagement. What are the things that could make our classes better in terms of reaching the increasingly diverse and varied experiences that our students are bringing? How do we know that our courses, our programs are reaching them in terms of the content matter, right? What are the things we can do to embrace the liberal arts education ideally, but maybe we haven't done? How do we know that we're doing that, right? How do we just look at curriculum and say, okay, we've got this course with this title, or do we start diving into syllabi and readings? Like, what are those things that we can start doing to envisioning how this can be embedded a little bit further into our everyday conversations and courses, not just in like one department, but across all of our departments, to have a better, more fulfilling conversation? It's a lot again, Nick, but big ideas, going all in here.
I want to just start to expand, ironically, expand your question a little bit, because I think what's also really important is it's not just what we put on the syllabus to make it more inclusive and dynamic, but how do we get more people also into research, into fellowships, and into different kind of opportunities, right? So if we're going to think about living up to the true liberal arts model, it is not just about what's on the syllabus, because even if you do change the syllabus, let's say if you get people to teach and you change the syllabus, are they getting into the research process? Are they getting into being the future people who the next generation will be reading? And when you were talking, I was thinking about how many people their gatekeeping course is their freshman seminar, right? Or the freshman writing course or the freshman math course. So before you even get to the gateway class, right? Before you even get to say, I want to major in this, I want to concentrate in this, your freshman seminar is already riddled with a whole bunch of social hurdles that prevent you from integrating into campus. So yes, I want us to look at our syllabi and understand, are we, and who we are not putting on, are we silencing certain voices, certain opinions, or really just not highlighting the contribution of women and scholars of color. I think about the panel at Stanford about 3 years ago. It was a history panel, and every single person who was listed was a man. And it was very interesting because it was just like, and so we need to really interrogate that and begin to understand it. But I don't want it to just stop at the syllabus. I want us to look at who are in research programs, and not just, even though I highly love and respect like Mellon Mays and Howard Hughes and other programs on campuses, but how do we also make sure that other research programs are able to be populated by the full range of people who are on campus, so that we can fully understand what it means to have a true liberal arts college experience. So I just want to put that out there with because I think that sometimes if we only focus on that, you're going to have some faculty who's going to put like one Black person on a syllabus, but then their advisees are still going to be 90% white, 85% male, 92% from the top 20% of the income distribution, and they're going to win advising awards for catering to the same exact people. And so if we don't begin to understand the many ways in which research and highlighting of research is done, we're going to set ourselves back quite a bit.
I want to tie some of that into one of the questions in the Q&A that asked about equity and how to define equity and what that means. Because arguably, I need to think about this a little more, but it's arguably could be straightforward to define equity and outcomes pretty clearly. If there's a desired outcome and there are no group disparities, you've got equity, yay. But I don't think you can quite do that in the same way for experiences. So just because you have the same experience with everyone doesn't mean that that experience is inherently as engaging, effective, meaningful, supportive, etc. for that. And I get concerned sometimes that that's what people are striving toward occasionally, is that equity, not just in outcomes, but in experiences, whereas it's like, well, actually, if we want the equity in outcomes, we actually need to think about how, not only because, I guess you could also do equal experiences that are designed in a way that are better suited toward students from marginalized identities. But in some ways, like the outcome should really be the goal, not the, similarity of experience necessarily.
I was going to say, yeah, that's one of my big concerns with the notion of high impact practices is for a lot of them, there's not enough evidence to really say that's the case. We do know with stronger research that it does work, but then we see this in a lot of commuter campuses is that students choose some institutions because of cost, and then they're not as engaged on campus because they've made the choice to keep their job, not take a loan, all those things. And we still have not dealt with an extent to, and I love what one of our scholar friends basically said, it's the notion of financial aid and financial supports that allow students to be full participants in the way we expect them to be in liberal arts education, in the undergraduate research, in all these others, whether it's study abroad and other things. And I've always loved the way Michigan has tried to tweak those things so that they did reach more students. But I would say the aid piece is missing from our equation. And as we look at disparities in experience and disparities in outcomes, that's part of the equation we need to roll in. And when we're so concerned about measuring the outcomes, measuring the experiences, but leaving that out, I think we do our students a disservice that really are dependent on those issues and why they do it. And I think it's just become really apparent in this pandemic moment where our students are home. I don't know if all of your students are at home, but our students at home, and they are helping their siblings learn. If their parents are such essential workers, they are not. Sometimes they are working too. And I do have students that are on their cell phone in class as they're driving to pick up kids at daycare. And this is a moment where we are seeing realities that if they're on campus, we tend to ignore. Maybe they can ignore it to a certain extent, but now that they're not, we're really seeing the full impact of that. So we really have to think about this moment as a transition moment, not just a transition, but a real reflection on how we really help a variety of students, not just to get access to the same activities, but also understanding why they cannot participate in some of those activities that we think are so enriching.
Thank you for that. I think, Sylvia, your point about taking this moment and kind of using it as a springboard to really tackling equity and injustice issues that are not just our campus issues, but our community issues that our students are having to navigate all day, every day, to really come to the fore for a lot of people. And I don't think you can design a course, especially right now, to fulfill the ideals of a liberal arts education, however envisioned, and expect people to have the ability to do those equally, as you were mentioning, in terms of like what are their family situations, their work situations. Our courses engaging students in certain ways with like what Tony was mentioning, different approaches to office hours to try to get students to talk a little bit more when maybe behind the screens on Zoom, they're just kind of disconnected because their mind is everywhere else, as it should be during a global health crisis, right? I mean, these are these real issues. But I think this also kind of brings us back to the importance of liberal arts education to critically think about what the issues of our times are, right? And helping students kind of use this moment to think through all of the complexity and all of the inequalities that maybe they're literally navigating more so than they thought they ever would. And so I guess, what are some of the takeaways from this moment that you would hope that we would incorporate into our conversations in our classrooms, whether it's public health, environmental racism, or are we talking about politics? Are we talking about social media usage and communication and technology? Are we thinking about the different components like you were mentioning, Sylvia, sense of belonging? What are some of these things that are really coming to the fore right now that maybe we haven't paid as much attention to, that we should try to build into our courses, whether it's pedagogically, just engagement-wise, course content, etc. What would we really want to take from this moment and put into our classrooms and into our educational curriculum for students to have in the future?
I think my biggest learning was conflict is an opportunity to learn. And that's the hardest thing, because we are taught to avoid it. They're taught to avoid it, to maintain relationships. We want to maintain order. We want to get through content. But sometimes that's the most important time to really have that engagement, whether that's online or in the classroom. And I think, certainly I've been informed by the dialogue process, where you say if you don't have conflict, you don't have enough skill building going on, and we have to really think about that. And it's Parker Palmer has 5 habits of the heart, and one of them is really this creative tension that conflict brings and understanding it. And I think we as instructors need to be better prepared to not handle it, but really not put a lid on it, but really let's have have processes for discussions. And those processes, if you stick to them as a pedagogy, they are very useful. Asking different kinds of questions. My class, we spend some time just practicing asking 8 different kinds of questions. And the reason is we want to make sure that there's no prejudgment, but also that there are different kinds of questions, everything from how you feel about something to causal, whether how do you think this relates to, so the systemic level, bring this. So we practice those things, because I think we've kind of beat it out of them. Don't ask questions, or if you ask questions, we don't have time for that. So I think we have to use this moment at least I feel we're doing that more online. We're taking a little bit more time. We're being a little more humane. So let's try to carry that forward, what learnings we've had and what we've had to do.
Yeah, I would say I hope there are some lessons that we use in this moment that I hope we use this moment as a set of lessons to push ourselves to think about things that, quite frankly, before times allowed the vast majority of us not to, right? I have talked to many college presidents and deans, and they were like, I just never knew so many of our students didn't have internet at home, right? And something that has become more salient in our minds now, something that I think our community college colleagues probably saw more than we did at 4-year research institutions, but it was still present. And just thinking about what are all the other lessons, especially for those who control the purse strings of universities and those who set the agenda, like boards of trustees. And so I fundamentally believe that there are lessons. I know that Jennifer Morton is trying to figure out what is COVID going to do for teaching going forward. And it is going to change us. I mean, universities are going to be different, but how does it change how we do science? How does it change wet labs and things like that? For me, what I've been finding in a very interesting way in the research I'm conducting right now is how COVID has, and it's the switch to online education, but not just the schooling, but everything, the meetings and things like that. More and more of the lower income students who I studied, who were afraid to go to office hours and were afraid to go to professors, there's a greater diversity in the double disadvantage about who's more willing to go now, because there is no line outside. There's no one seeing you go or not. There's no social dance anymore. It's literally choosing a slot that no one knows what you're going to have and no one knows what's being talked about. And so it's going to be very interesting how even something as small, but yet as fundamental to the liberal arts experience as office hours are going to, I hope, change a bit, because what we're seeing is the hurdle has been lowered for some students. And can we build on that? And so I look forward to returning to my own work about how social class shapes how students engage with faculty, to be like, well, look, we have a moment here to investigate this, because there are lessons to be had for across different entities, career services, mental health services, the library. How are we asking for help in general in this moment? Will this be a fundamental shift in that?
Nick, any concluding thoughts on this matter?
Unfortunately, I'm afraid some of my concluding thoughts is a typical academic move of, I'm going to pose questions instead of providing meaningful answers. I mean, I've thought about this issue a fair bit, and because I've heard some people who say, well, all this, doing coursework, and it's important, as we think about all these things that aren't like formal in class meeting sessions, but, like, oh, well, people like, we don't have to actually go to campus. We can do all this stuff online, et cetera, like, and I'm like, yeah, and maybe it's just the fact that I like seeing people in person, but I'm thinking like, well, actually, what, don't people want to go back together, and meet, actually sit around face to face and look at one another? And so I think the challenge that, again, I wish I could say I had the right answer to is, how do you get this blend? So maybe, for instance, office hours, are just done just as well, via Zoom, but yet some classes happen, in person, and maybe there's just a greater heterogeneity or greater options for how classes are administered or students can engage in those classes. And whether that's because we're offering multiple different sections that are taught in different ways, or because we get better at figuring out, am I still here? Good, I froze for a second on my own screen. We get better at figuring out what a great example, in fact, at this technology and how to make it work, and work reliably in a meaningful manner, and get it to work for all students too, because especially as we think of students from lower income backgrounds who live in more rural locations, having that internet connectivity to be able to engage in a meaningful way can be a real challenge.
As you mentioned, Nick, that's a pretty good example. We still got ways to go with our technology issues. That's for sure. And closing not just the digital divide, but the functionality of our technology, if we want to try to bring more engagement with our students. So I really appreciate all three of you joining us for this conversation today. I know there was a lot of discussion around liberal arts education, but not necessarily liberal arts education proper. And I think that's really important for people to engage with, that the substance of what goes on in the classroom can't be disconnected from the campus itself, nor our students' lives off campus, right? And so I think that's really helpful for thinking through how effective a course could be, how effective a program can be for the future. So before we all depart, I want to take this last opportunity to remind everybody in the audience of the next seminar in the Colloquium series, Measuring Liberal Education, a report from the College and Beyond 2 study at the University of Michigan. which will take place on Friday, March 19th at 2 p.m. Researchers will offer an overview of the driving questions of the project, how can we measure liberal education, and discuss the administrative data and alumni survey data being collected right now, and talk through how the project is using that data to answer questions about liberal arts education, its qualities, and students' education and outcomes associated with these programs. It'll be a great discussion, and I hope we'll see everybody back. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon.